How in your career did you start working with global history, and what defines global history in your conception?
Okay, I think that's a bit of a tricky question because I come from area studies. So I've been working on India and on South Asia throughout my academic career. I mean, from my student days onward. And working on a colonial history is not possible without looking at some form of global history. At least it should be the global history involving both the colonizing society and the colonized society. So some form of contact between two countries at two different parts of the globe was always part of the project of area studies, at least for the modern times. This does not mean that it would correspond directly to what we would call global history today. So on the one hand, it definitely did not encompass other colonized societies than South Asia at the time when I was doing my studies. And I remember one event during my student days. My Doktorvater, my doctorate supervisor, had invited someone to our institute, the South Asia Institute in Heidelberg, who was working on the colonial history of, I think it was Nigeria. And we were all completely shocked that we had to attend this, or it was suggested that we attend this lecture, because it has nothing at all to do with what we were doing, we thought at that time, because it was African history and we were doing South Asian history. So what kind of connection could there even be? So in how far could it be relevant for what we were doing? So I think that really shows how much things have changed in a generation. None of my students would ever react that way or feel it as an imposition to interact with someone from African or Latin American or Chinese history. So it is very much taken for granted that we have to look at Indian and at South Asian history in a global context. And I think the second point, which changed fundamentally, is that area studies in the traditional way of looking at it was a history of diffusion. So what interested us, if we were looking at interactions with Britain in our case, was how British ideas reached India, how they were transformed, how there was resistance, how they were rejected, etc. And it is only in the late 90s that the very idea of the possibility of an entanglement started to be thinkable. So to look no longer at what did they send to India, did it arrive there, was it rejected, was it adapted whatsoever, but also the question, how did the fact of being a colonizing power, how did the fact of interacting with colonies have an impact on the colonizers themselves? So I think that is very much gained today, that no one would be able to talk about British history, about French history, about Spanish history at a slightly earlier stage, Italian history, German history, without taking into account that they were colonizing societies and colonizing nations. So I think that is really the main shift that happened.
All right, thank you. What are the possibilities for dialogue between the local and the global, the micro and the macro? That's our second question.
Well, I think it is not only a possibility, but really an imperative that we do not do global history without taking into consideration the local and the regional. So if we are looking at forms of entanglement, there is always a danger that we take the perspective of an eagle and just fly over the globe, without being able to see what is happening on the ground. And I think in that case, it is really important to bring in the local, to have a global history which is area-based, which acknowledges and makes use of the heritage we have in the area studies and doesn't barge off to a global level from the get-go. And on the other hand, of course, it is just as important that the area studies don't remain in their tiny little bubbles where they look only at their own area, where they are not able to look at any form of contact with other colonies, with the colonizing power, but also at the contexts which remained extremely important in the 18th, 19th, and even 20th century, which date from a pre-colonial time. So, for instance, for the area that I'm working on the one hand, that would be the whole field of research centered on the Indian Ocean. So the contacts between India on the one hand and Africa, the Arab countries, and to some extent also the coastal part of Iran, but also the contact which we are less aware of, which really played a role until, well, at least until the beginning of the 20th century. And I think they are coming back now. What was the traditional Persephone? So the interrelations among the territories and countries which had Persian as their primary language. So the contact between Iran, Afghanistan, in North India on the one hand, but also the whole contacts which went into Central Asia.
Thank you. That's a very resonant question among our students. This leads to some confusion over if global history is trying to get rid of regional history. And that's a very resonant question. Thank you for your response, Professor. The next question, I suppose it leads to an important issue into your work, actually. It's how to work with the multiple temporalities of global history.
Okay, in that case, I think if you allow me, I would like to enter from a different point. So we will reach temporalities, but I would like to do it linking it back to the question that you have just asked on the global and the local, and mentioning the importance of language, which of course to you as a conceptual historian, I don't need to explain how important language is for the actors in order to make sense of the world that they're living in, the importance of concepts in order, on the one hand, to understand the world, but also to find their own place, to situate themselves in the world, to create their own order of what they are living through, and also to be able to act meaningfully in this world. So if we want to explain not only intellectual history, but also social and political history, I think we do well to look at language, to look at concepts, if we want to see what is happening through the perspective of the actors and see in how far certain actions, certain practices, activities make sense for them and how they arrive at this meaning and this sense. So that in turn, of course, means that translation, the contact between languages, is extremely important for global history. And that is true on both levels. It is true on the level of the contact between the actors. So we always tend to take it very much for granted that in global history, contacts happen and people influence each other without really asking how that works out in practice. So if if ideas are traveling from one place to the other, if actors are traveling, how do they communicate? Which are the languages they are using? What does it mean if they have to translate their ideas into a different idea, into a different language? How does the language then impact on the way, again, that they orient themselves? And how is this communication through languages possible? And that, to my mind, is one of the great dangers that global history is facing at the moment. And that has something to do with this eagle eye view that I just mentioned. That, of course, for a student or even for a younger academic, it is very tempting, if they have a global history project, to go to the sources of the former colonizing power. And unless they are lucky that it is the same language, so I imagine the problem is not quite as urgent for Latin America than it would be for Asia and for Africa, it means being restricted to the archives where you can read the language. And in most of the cases, that would be the archives in Paris and in London, which means that we are reintroducing a colonial perspective by doing global history. I can completely understand the need for younger scholars to be pragmatic. You can't ask a doctoral student to learn 2 or 3 languages before they even start their academic career. If they have 3 or 4 or 5 years, if they're lucky, for their PhD, they can't spend 3 years of that learning a new language. So I think doing global history is something that is really difficult at the level of PhD students. It becomes a little bit more easy once you reach the postdoc level. And especially what I would advocate very strongly is we have to find new ways of collaborating across area studies. So even if you have all the time in the world and you are willing to learn languages as much as needed, you will never be able to learn more. I mean, for someone normally gifted, there's some other people, but I'm talking for the normally gifted person. If you're lucky, you learn, in the end, you have 3 or 4 languages with which you can really work, including your own mother tongue. That doesn't really get you very far in global history, doesn't it? So if you want to compare between regions, if you want to bring out entanglements with the colonizing powers, if you want to really look in depth on the language that the actors are using, this is more than a single person can do. So I think this is one of the challenges of global history that we are not taking serious enough at the moment, that it is not only a new methodology and a new theory that we're needing, but we are also needing new ways of collaborating in larger groups. So Helge Jortheim and I have tried to do that with a group of, I think we were 14, over 4 years, working on the single concept of civility and we did not try to cover the whole globe. So we restricted our work to, I think it was 4 European and 9 Asian languages. But that already means that we need a team of 13, 14, 15 people. And the way that research is organized at the moment, on the one hand, it is really difficult to find people who are willing to engage in such a collaboration over an extended period of time instead of pursuing their own research. And on the other hand, it is also, if at the moment we are training our students to work in a very solitary way. So we're training them because that is the only way they can do their PhD. they can only do that as a single authored monograph. So we are training them as lonely fighters in a way. And then if they do their second book, again, which is necessary for moving along the academic career, again, they have to have it single authored. So they reach the age of, they are in their late 30s, early 40s, and they have always worked on their own books. And then suddenly we tell them, now you have to collaborate. And they hate it. I mean, most of them. We had a wonderful group, so there was no problem at all there, and really came together greatly as a group. But to find people who are willing to write together, to allow other people influence on what they are writing, to discuss the way that influences move between different regions, between different cultures, between different languages, which is something that none of us can do on their own. So it is really through dialogue that we discover who are the important people that we should be following up. And we can only do that once we come together and work together. And that then, of course, raises the question of the temporalities. And that was something we really discussed very intensely in this civility project, because if you want to look at contexts and at entanglements, you have to have a common time frame. So it is not possible to say, well, the person working on Arab civility is very interested in the early 19th century. So that's okay. So let her work on the early 19th century. Someone working on China is more interested in what's happening in the interwar period. So they work on the interwar period. And perhaps someone working on Korea says the most important development in civility is taking place after the Second World War. So let them work on the period after the Second World War. You can do that, but then it means you lose the advantage of collaboration. You lose the advantage of seeing actors traveling from one region to the other, people developing texts together, people reading each other's journals, the actors reading each other's journals and reacting to that. This is only happening at the contemporary level. So if you don't have a common framework, a common time frame, you lose this advantage. On the other hand, of course, it is very challenging to come up with this time frame because every country is not following the same rhythm. So some events, some developments might be slightly earlier or slightly later in different countries, not to the extent that we would go back to a model of stages of development, but still to assume that everything is happening exactly at the same time is also doing violence to the history of the different countries. So I think it is really one of the tricky questions is to give this leeway, to see that countries may have a difference, but still have a common reference point, because otherwise there will be no conversation among the scholars.
Well, the next question, Professor, it goes, does any kind of research object have the potential to become global history?
I think the potential I would not have a problem with. So you could look at, I don't know whether I would commit to every research topic, but I think most of the research topics can be brought into global history some way or the other. The question is whether it makes sense or not. I wouldn't go for a global history imperialism and say this now is the only way to do history and every project has to be a global history project. I think there are projects which are still meaningful in a local or in a regional framework. Usually it helps if people are aware of what is happening in the broader world so that they can bring it in if that explains something. But I would not have a new imperative saying either do global history or you are a bad historian.
All right. And the last question our students made is, what are the main risks and challenges in global history? I suppose you already addressed some of them, but if you'd like to elaborate a little more, then the risks and challenges.
I think the risk really is that global history is taking over area studies. I mean, I'm still using the term area studies. I know it's a highly problematic term, and your students hopefully will barge on that and saying, why is she so old-fashioned to still call that? The only reason why I'm still doing that is I haven't found another concept which is more convincing. So to just call it regional studies might also be problematic. So the danger is that global history is taking that over, and it might already happen in some areas that, or in some world regions, that chairs at the university which were dedicated to area studies at an earlier stage are now redefined as global history chairs. The problem then is if that leads to a neocolonialism by no longer giving voice to people in different regions, but just going for the easy way, which is usually the way focusing on the European archive and the European languages, then I see a great danger in that. And this goes together with the danger that, of course, we're talking in English now, so the analytical concepts that we are using are concepts which are embedded in English and in a European tradition, which in and by itself is perhaps not so much of a problem as long as we are aware of that. It becomes a problem once we try to use these concepts to make sense of other cultures which have concepts of their own. So if we are trying to impose concepts like religion, like civilization, like civil society, even like state, like middle class on other countries, which would order their world through different concepts, then we risk distortion and we risk reinforcing a colonial perspective. So there again, we come back to the really important role that language and concepts at the level of the actors, but also at the level of the analytical concepts play in order to allow us to do a global history, which is not a reinvention of colonialism, but which really takes into account different perspectives on the world.